Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing Mary and the Witch's Flower. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Mary and the Witch's Flower, there's a bit of a history to this one. So first off, I should start off by saying that I'm a big fan of Studio Ghibli. I think some of Studio Ghibli's films are amongst the greatest movies ever to have been made. And so you can imagine that I and many others were disappointed back around 2014 when we learned that Studio Ghibli would not be making movies in the near future. Now, since then, they have actually made and released a film. Unfortunately, it was made in CG, and from what I've heard, it's a bit of a lesser film in their catalogue. But at least they are making films again. However, some people couldn't wait that long. Hiromasa Yonebayashi, who directed Arrietty and When Marnie Was There, decided to head off and make his own studio called, I believe it's called Studio Ponoc. It's spelled P-O-N-O-C. Admittedly, I haven't heard anyone pronounce that, so I could be mispronouncing it, but I do believe it is called Studio Ponoc. And Mary and the Witch's Flower was the debut film from this new studio, and it was being directed by Hiromasa Yonebayashi himself. So as you might imagine, expectations were quite high for this film, and of course the question is this film any good? And that's what I'm going to be answering today. So let's get started. So what is the story of Mary and the Witch's Flower? The film opens up with a young girl called Mary Smith. Mary Smith is living with her great aunt Charlotte. Apparently her parents sent her there so that she could attend school while they were off working away on something else, but they will be coming around the next week or so. However, Mary Smith is quite bored in this environment, and she attempts to help some of the staff with some pretty disastrous results. But eventually she comes across these two cats, and these two cats lead her into the woods where she finds a flower. And this flower, when she crushes the bulb of one of them, gives her incredibly powerful magic. Eventually she is whisked off to this magical school called Endor College, and that's how the story begins. Now, with regards to the story itself is in many ways quite enjoyable. There's a great sense of mystery, there's a great sense of humor, and there are even some twists and turns in the story. As a whole, the story itself is quite intriguing and interesting with a lot of great action sequences. But there is a particular issue that I had with this film, and that is actually to do with its pacing. The beginning of the film is actually a little slower than I would have cared for, and perhaps this slowness was meant to convey the kind of boredom that Mary Smith is going through at the time. But even so, I think that the beginning of the film could have been sped up a bit. And then, interestingly, when she reaches Endor College, the film suddenly becomes too quick. And again, I think this might have been an intentional move on Hiromasa Yonebayashi's part. Well, I think the information to be so overwhelming that the audience kind of mimics Mary's kind of overwhelmed nature with that scene. But even so, I do think that that sequence could have been better paced, particularly given how the rest of the movie plays out from that point. Now, interestingly, I had no problem with the pacing for the last third of the film. So I don't know if it was a bit of a Goldilocks effect. The first part was too slow, the second part was too fast, but the third part was just right, which is quite interesting. Nonetheless, even with the pacing issues, the story itself is engaging and interesting, and I found myself quite entertained by the film. Now, with regards to the cast of characters, Mary Smith herself is a very charming main character. She's full of energy, she is very adventurous, and while she can be quite overwhelmed by some of the sequences in this film, she never lets it get to her too much, and perseveres throughout all these trials and tribulations. And taking all of that into account, I think she's a pretty good protagonist for the film. Now, does she stand on the same level of so many of the other protagonists in other Studio Ghibli films? No, and in fact, this comparison with Studio Ghibli will, I think, be the most damaging part to this film. Studio Ghibli, as I mentioned before, have created some of the greatest films of all time, and so it is not easy to be able to reach that standard. And while this film itself is quite enjoyable, I do think that it does pale compared to many other Studio Ghibli films. If this had been released under Studio Ghibli, I think this would be considered to be a lesser work in their catalogue. Highly enjoyable, highly entertaining, but failing to reach that level of quality that we expect from the greatest of Studio Ghibli films. Nonetheless, I do want to re-emphasize the fact that I did enjoy this film, and I think it's very entertaining. Now, with regards to the animation, the animation here is what a lot of people will be focusing on. First off, it's important to point out the artwork and the fact that the artwork here has a very Studio Ghibli aesthetic, particularly from their later films. If you've seen the art style from Hiromasa Yonebayashi's previous works, such as in Arrietty, as in When Marnie Was There, as well as some of the more recent Studio Ghibli films like Howl's Moving Castle, The Wind Rises, etc., etc., you will be very familiar with this art style aesthetic. However, the thing I want to point out here is the level of quality of the animation itself. Studio Ghibli is known for having an animation quality greater than most other studios in the industry, and I remember going into this film and wondering, can Studio Ponoc reach that level of quality? And I'm happy to say that for the most part they actually do manage to achieve that. There is a sense of fluidity in the animation of this film that is missing from a lot of other anime films, which can quite often be quite stiff by comparison. There is an incredible amount of detail in the backgrounds, and overall I think that the animation here is absolutely stupendous. Now, does it reach the level of quality as seen in most Studio Ghibli films? And the answer here is almost. There are a few sequences within the film that are probably a little stiffer than you'd be used to if you were watching a Studio Ghibli film, but I don't want to take away from the fact that this is an incredibly well animated film, and that this is a standard of animation that most other anime studios could only dream of being able to reach. With regards to the soundtrack, now the soundtrack for this film is quite good. The music very well conveys like the sense of comedy, the sense of tension, the sense of threat, the sense of adventure. And while I wasn't as taken with the theme song of this film as most other theme songs, in particular, of course, I think everyone remembers how good the theme song for Arrietty was. Nonetheless, the soundtrack for this film is excellent. With regards to the voice cast, now it's interesting to note that this box that I have, the UK edition, has both an English dub and a Japanese dub. And I initially watched this film in Japanese, and then I ended up rewatching it in English. So I have actually seen both the Japanese dub and the English dub. And it's worth noting that the performances are excellent in each version. So if you want to watch this film in Japanese or you want to watch this film in English, you should have no problems with it. However, when it comes to my own personal preference, and this will surprise some people, I actually do prefer to watch this film in English. And there's two very specific reasons for it. First off, this film has a very British aesthetic. And interestingly, the English dub actually makes use of a lot of British actors and actresses. And because of that, I just feel that it suits the setting more in this film. And so I just found it more enjoyable in English. But to me, one of the most decisive aspects of why I enjoy the English more than the Japanese is the voice performance for the main character, Mary Smith. In the original Japanese, I wasn't quite taken with Mary Smith's voice, at least for the first part of the film.
見てティブほら私にぴったりこれならゼベディさんのお手伝いもできるよコンフューシャスあんたも行くわけないわねあんたは As the film went on, I thought she kind of grew into the role more, and by the end of the film she was giving a pretty good performance. But I thought she was a bit stiff and, to be honest, slightly unnatural at the beginning of the film. In contrast, Ruby Barnhill gives a fantastic performance as Mary Smith, and I think that her performance is one of the most defining aspects of why I enjoy the English dub more than the Japanese. But look at this, Tib. It's exactly the right height for me. Maybe now I'll be able to help Zebedee. Confucius, are you coming? I'll take that as a no then.
So to reiterate, I think both dubs are pretty good, but personally I prefer the English dub for both the British aesthetic and for Ruby Barnhill's voice of the main character. Finally, I would like to discuss the release of this film. Now, as I said before, this is the British release of this film. I believe it's released on both DVD and Blu-ray. It's released by a distributor called Altitude, which, to be honest, I'm a little on the unfamiliar side with.
but they do a pretty good release of this film. One of the things that stood out to me actually is when you reach the main menu, instead of having a language select option and then, you know, watching the film, it actually presents both an English version and a Japanese version. And as far as I can tell, the only reason that they did that was so that the title cards would show in either Japanese or in English, as well as the credits. So that is certainly an interesting way to release the film, but I do think that it actually does serve the film quite well, simply because for those of you who are fanatical about, you know, seeing the original Japanese title for this film, as well as seeing the film in Japanese credits, you do have the option. And then for those who want to see the English language title of this film and the English language credits for this film, you're able to do so as well. So it will serve both fans very well. The picture quality is absolutely lovely in this film, and the Blu-ray really makes the animation stand out here. I think this is a film that absolutely deserves to be seen on Blu-ray because of how high quality the animation and artwork is. Beyond that, we do actually have quite a range of extras for this film. A couple of them being stuff like an NTV special, or I believe that's Nippon Television in Japan. That kind of gave a lot of information about Mary and the Witch's Flower and how it was created. They have a conversation with the people who made the main title theme for this film, which again I will say that I wasn't as taken with this main title theme as with many other Studio Ghibli films, but it's still quite respectable and it is quite interesting. Beyond that, we have some press conferences, we have some interviews with the film creators, and of course we also have some trailers and TV spots. So as a package, this is actually quite a nice release, and I do have to say that Altitude, even though I'm quite unfamiliar with them as a distributor, actually did quite a great job with this release. So I'm very pleased with this edition. So overall, what are my thoughts on Mary and the Witch's Flower? I think it's a very enjoyable film and a very strong opening for this new Studio Ponoc. However, I do have to confess that of the three Hiromasa Yonebayashi films that I've seen, Arrietty, When Marnie Was There, and now Mary and the Witch's Flower, I do have to say that this is the weakest of the three, with Arrietty being in second and When Marnie Was There being number one by quite a distance. But even so, I think that this is still a highly enjoyable film. And if you are a fan of Studio Ghibli, if you are a fan of Hiromasa Yonebayashi, then you owe it to yourself to go and seek out this film and to watch it, because it is highly enjoyable, it is highly entertaining, and the animation sets a standard that most animation studios could only dream of reaching. So that was my review of Mary and the Witch's Flower. If you have seen this film, what did you think of it? Did you like it? Did you not like it? If you watched it in both Japanese and English, which did you prefer and why? And of course, if you have any other information that you'd like to give about this film, about Studio Ponoc, about Hiromasa Yonebayashi, leave the information in the comments below. So thanks for watching, don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.